I do not love her. The 5 words left Ivar, Duke of Veldian, before he had weighed their cost, and no sooner had they left him than he heard, beyond the study door, the small catch of breath that told him he had not been overheard only by the man seated across from him with his ledger and his smirk. He had been overheard by his wife. He did not turn at once. He could not with Silas Vane watching him the way a card player watches a hand he suspects is bluffed, waiting to see if the Duke's eyes would flick toward the door and betray what the words had truly cost him. So Ivar held his gaze steady on Vane's soft, unhurried face, and he let the silence stretch, and behind the door he heard the whisper of skirts drawing back, quick and light, like a bird startled off a sill. There, Van said, folding his hands over the paper he had laid upon the desk between them, a paper with old ink upon it, a dead man's signature, and figures enough to ruin a name if it were read aloud in the wrong room. That is all I wish to hear, your grace. A man does not pay so dearly to protect a woman he loves. He pays to protect his pride. I understand pride. I have made my whole trade of it. He rose, drawing his gloves through his fingers, and Ivar despised him with a thoroughness that surprised even himself, for he had thought, 3 months into this marriage, that he had already learned the whole shape of what he could hate. You have your answer, Ivar said. Now take your paper and go, and do not send word to this house again. When you have paid what is owed your grace, I will trouble you no further. Vane inclined his head, an insolent little bow, and let himself out through the far door into the passage that led to the stable yard, as he always did, like a man who came and went by servants' ways, because he knew he was not fit to be seen using any other. Ivar stood a moment with his hand flat upon the desk, feeling the 5 words still in his mouth, something bitter he could not spit fast enough. He crossed the room in 3 strides and opened the study door onto the empty corridor. Empty, but not quite. Near the threshold, half caught beneath the edge of the carpet runner, lay a small thing dropped in haste. A scrap of linen, no larger than his palm, worked with the beginnings of an embroidered vine in green silk thread. The needle still fixed through the cloth as though the hand that held it had let go without meaning to. He crouched and lifted it, and turned it over, and could make nothing of it save that it was fine work, careful work, the kind a woman does not abandon lightly. He went after her. He found her rooms empty, the fire banked low, her lady's maid Nell folding linens with a face that gave away nothing though her eyes slid once, quickly, toward the window that looked down on the east garden. Ivar thanked her and went out through the long gallery, past the ranks of Vane ancestors in their black frames, dukes and duchesses who had none of them, so far as he knew, stood outside a closed door and heard their own husband deny loving them, and he told himself, as he walked, that she could not have heard the whole of it, that she could not know what the words meant, only that they had been said, and that not knowing was a mercy he did not deserve to lean upon, and yet he leaned upon it all the same, because the alternative was unbearable. He had married Rhoda Jocelyn a little over 4 months before, in a ceremony so quickly arranged that half the county still spoke of it as though it were a scandal rather than a kindness, though only a handful of people living knew it had been both, a scandal averted and a kindness given in the same stroke. Her father, Squire Edmund Jocelyn, had been a soft, easy, foolish man, generous with money he did not have and worse with money he had borrowed to have more of it, and in the last year of his life he had come to owe Silas Vane a sum that no sale of land could answer, for the debt was not only in coin but in paper. A note bearing the Jocelyn name that, in Vane's hands, could be read as something far glibber than debt, if Vane chose to whisper the right word into the right ear at the right assembly. Ivar had known the squire slightly, as a boy knows a neighbour who once pulled him half-drowned from the mill pond and never spoke of it again nor asked for thanks. And when word reached Veldian that the old man lay dying and had sent for the Duke by name, Ivar had gone more out of old debt than present duty, and had sat at a bedside grown and grey, and had made a promise he had not entirely understood the weight of until it was already given. Look after her, the squire had said, gripping Ivar's wrist with a strength seemed borrowed from somewhere beyond his failing body. Vane will have her one way or the other, my lord, in marriage or in shame, he does not care which, so long as he has her. I have nothing left to give her but a name he can ruin. Give her yours instead. I do not ask you to love her. I ask only that you keep her from him. He had not asked Eva to love her. That was the truth the 5 words had been built upon, and it was also, Ivar thought grimly as he came out into the garden and saw her at last, a truth that had stopped being the whole of the matter within a fortnight of the wedding, and had stopped mattering to him at all within a month. She stood at the far end of the yew walk, near the stone bench where she liked to sit in the mornings with her work basket, though this morning the basket was nowhere in sight and her hands were empty, pressed one over the other at her waist in a way that struck him, from a distance, as a woman holding herself together by main force. She did not hear him approach on the soft turf, or she heard and chose not to turn, and when he spoke her name she startled all the same, as though he had come upon her from very far away. Rhoda. Your Grace. She turned, and her face was composed, too composed, the way a still pond is not calm but simply undisturbed. Waiting, her eyes were dry, which frightened him more than tears would have. I did not know you had finished your business with Mr. Vane. So she had heard his name, at least, if not more. You were at the door. I was passing the door. A small lie offered without heat, the kind that closes a subject rather than opening it. I had thought to speak with you before luncheon, but I see you were occupied, and as nothing of consequence. What did you wish to speak of? For one moment. He would think of it many times in the weeks that followed, turning it over like the scrap of embroidered linen still folded in his waistcoat pocket. Her hand rose from her waist as though it meant to press itself there again, to some private purpose he did not yet understand, and her mouth opened, and he thought she would tell him. Then something in her seemed to close, gently and completely, like a door drawn to without a sound, and she said only, "Nothing that will not keep, Your Grace. You look tired. I hope Mr. Vane did not bring troubling news." He brings nothing but trouble, whatever news he carries. Ivar studied her, searching for some crack in the composure, some sign of what she had heard and how much of it she believed. Rhoda, if you heard anything just now that gave you pause. I heard a man's voice and a door. And I have no great curiosity about your business affairs, Your Grace. She said it lightly, and stepped past him toward the house, and the lightness of it was worse than any accusation could have been, for he understood, watching her go, that she had built the sentence carefully. The way one builds a wall, smooth-faced, and meant to give nothing away, and meant, too, to keep him out. He let her go. He told himself it was because he did not yet know what to say that would not require him to speak of Vane, and of the debt, and of the old note with her father's name on it. And he had promised himself from the first week of the marriage that she would never learn of that note if he could help it, for he had seen what it had done to her, in the small unguarded moments before their wedding, merely to know that her father had died believing he had failed her. He would not have her carry the knowledge of exactly how. That was his to carry. That, and the 5 words, and whatever cost either one of them might yet exact from a marriage he had entered as a promise and found, within weeks, had become something else entirely. Something he had no ready name for, only a certainty, sharp as a blade turned inward, that he could not lose her now for anything so foolish as silence. He found the embroidered scrap in his pocket that evening, dressing for a dinner she did not come down to, pleading a headache that Nell delivered with a face schooled into blankness that matched her mistress's too well to be entirely honest. He turned the little square of linen over in his fingers by candlelight, the half-finished vine, the needle still threaded, and could not account for why a woman would begin such careful, patient work and abandon it mid-stitch outside his study door. Unless she had come there with some particular purpose that the work was meant to accompany, a gift, perhaps, or an announcement dressed in silk thread rather than words. Something she had meant to give him along with whatever she had come to say before she heard him say the opposite of it through an oak door 3 inches thick. He did not know. He would not let himself guess, for every guess he made frightened him more than the last. And he was not a man given to fright. He had faced down men with pistols and men with worse, mothers-in-law, with sharper tongues than either, and Silas Vane's oily threats had never once made his hand shake on a pen. But the thought of Rhoda standing at that door with something gentle in her hands, hearing him say, "I do not love her," in the flattest voice he owned, and turning away without a word rather than asking him what he meant, that thought sat in his chest all through dinner like a stone he could not swallow past. He ate alone at the long table, His mother, the Dowager Duchess, having gone to bed early with one of her headaches that were never quite as severe as Rhoda's were tonight. And Hodge the butler moved about him with the particular soft-footed discretion of a servant who has served a house long enough to know when something in it has gone quietly, dangerously wrong, and Ivar found himself speaking aloud, once, to the empty chair across from him where Rhoda ought to have sat, though he caught the words back before Hodge could hear more than the first of them, and finished his wine instead, and thought of Vane's paper, still folded in the desk drawer of the study, and of the promise he had made to a dying man who had not asked him to love his daughter, only to keep her safe, which he had thought 4 months ago would be the easier vow of the two to keep. He climbed the stairs that knighed her door and stood outside it longer than he meant to, listening for some sound, weeping, perhaps, or the creak of a chair, anything that would tell him she was awake and might be spoken to. There was nothing, only the deep, waiting silence of a house at rest. And behind that door, though he did not know it yet and would not know it for some weeks more, his wife lay dry-eyed in the dark with one hand pressed flat against her own middle, where a secret of her own had begun to grow 6 weeks quiet beneath her heart, and which she had meant, that very morning, to lay before him like the gentlest gift she had ever given anyone, before 5 words through an oak door had taught her, wrongly, but with a wrongness she could not yet see past, that the gift would not be wanted. He went to his own chamber at last, and did not sleep. And in the grey hour before dawn he took the scrap of green-threaded linen from his waistcoat and set it in the drawer of his writing table, beside a miniature portrait he had commissioned in secret not 3 weeks past and had not yet found the courage, or perhaps only the right evening, to give her, a small oval likeness of her own face, painted from memory and from the artist's careful study of her at church of a Sunday, meant as a token of a devotion he had never once told her the size of, because he had thought, foolishly, that there would be time enough for telling. Once she had learned to trust that he meant to stay. He closed the drawer. Somewhere below him, in the sleeping house, Silas Vane's paper waited in the study desk like a coal banked under ash, and somewhere above him, behind a door he had not dared to open, his wife lay awake with the truth of her own folded close against her heart. And between the two of them, unspoken, the 5 words sat like a wall neither yet knew how to begin tearing down. 3 days passed in which Ivar watched his wife grow smaller by inches, though she did not lose an ounce of flesh nor a hair's breadth of height. It was some other diminishment, harder to name, the drawing in of a woman who has decided to take up as little room in a house as she can manage. She came down to breakfast, ate almost nothing. She sat with her work-basket in the morning room and did not sew. She answered his questions in the fewest words that courtesy allowed, and twice he came upon her standing quite still at a window with her hand pressed to her waist, in that same gesture he had seen in the garden, and both times she moved her hand away the instant she saw him, as though he had caught her at something shameful. He thought of confronting her outright, of saying, plainly, "I know you heard something through that door, and I beg you to let me explain it." But each time he gathered himself to do it, he found the explanation itself lodged behind his teeth like a stone too large to pass. To tell her the truth of the 5 words, he must tell her of Vane, and of the note, and of her father's debt, and of the particular ugly threat Vane had made not an hour before Ivar spoke those words, that he, Vane, had begun to hint, in the manner of a man laying groundwork rather than making an accusation outright, that a wife so plainly, publicly adored by her husband made a most convenient lever. Love her openly, Vane had said, turning the old note over in his soft fingers, and I need only let it be known what her father owed me, and how, and watch what it does to a marriage built on so much tender feeling. Deny her, and I have nothing left to threaten you with, for a man who does not love his wife cannot be made to fear for her. It had seemed, in the moment, the only weapon Ivar owned. He had said the 5 words the way a soldier throws down his own colours rather than let the enemy seize them, not because the colours meant nothing, but because they meant everything, and could not be permitted to fall into the wrong hands. He had thought himself rather clever in the cold accounting of it, right up until he heard her breath catch beyond the door. Now he watched her retreat from him by degrees, and understood that his cleverness had cost more than he had reckoned for. And still he could not bring himself to undo it, speaking Vane's threats aloud to her, for what would she carry? Not only the belief that he did not love her, but the knowledge that her own father's memory hung by a money-lender's whim, and that she herself was, in Vane's calculation, a thing to be used. He had promised the squire he would spare her that. He meant to keep the promise even now, even at the cost of being misunderstood by the very woman he had made it for. His sister, Lady Constance, arrived on the 4th day from her own house 2 counties distant, summoned by nothing more than a letter from their mother complaining, in the dowager's fashion, that the new duchess had grown strange, and that someone ought to look into it, since Ivar plainly would not. Constance was 5 years Ivar's junior, sharp-eyed, unmarried by choice rather than misfortune, and possessed of a bluntness their mother despaired of and Ivar privately treasured. "She is unhappy," Constance said to him on the 2nd evening of her visit, finding him alone in the library with a book he was not reading. "I have known Rhoda Jocelyn since we were girls together at the Ashworth assemblies, Ivar, and I tell you she does not sulk. She was never a sulking creature. Whatever this is, it sits on her like a stone, not a sulk. I am aware. Are you aware of the cause?" He set the book down. "I said something to another man, in this house, not meaning it to be heard by her, and she heard it, and misunderstood it entirely, and I cannot correct the misunderstanding without telling her a thing I have sworn not to tell her." Constance regarded him with particular patience she reserved for explaining obvious matters to a brother she loved but did not always credit with sense. "Then you have made a very poor bargain, brother, trading her present unhappiness for her future ignorance, and calling it protection. What was the thing you said?" He did not answer at once, and something in his silence must have told her more than words would have, for her face changed, softened, then sharpened again with a different understanding. "You said something unkind about your feeling for her." "I said I do not love her." Constance's eyebrows rose very high indeed. "To whom?" "To a man who would use the truth against her if he knew it. And do you love her?" The question, put so plainly by his own sister in his own library, struck him with more force than he expected, and he found himself answering it before he had decided to. "More than I have loved anything in my life, and I did not know it would happen so quickly or so completely, or that I would be fool enough to deny it to the one person who most needed to hear it said." Constance was quiet a moment, turning this over. "Then you have 2 choices, Ivar, and only 2. You may tell her the whole truth, whatever danger you fear in it, and trust her to bear it as a grown woman rather than a child to be shielded. Or you may go on protecting her from a truth she does not want protection from, and lose her regard entirely while you do it. I do not think there is a third road, whatever you have been telling yourself in this library of an evening." He did not answer her, because he did not yet know which choice he could bring himself to make, and Constance, wise enough not to press a wound freshly opened, changed the subject to their mother's latest complaint about the state of the Succession House roses, and left him alone with his book and his silence not long after. He went up that night meaning, at last, to knock upon Rhoda's door and say something. He had not decided what. Only that silence had proven itself a poor strategy, and he could not go on watching fold smaller by the day. But when he came to her chamber, he found the door standing a little open, and within, by the light of a single candle, Nell, the lady's maid, was on her knees beside an open trunk, folding gowns with quick, careful hands, while Rhoda stood at the window with her back to the room, her arms wrapped about herself. He stopped in the doorway, unseen by either of them, and understood, with a cold drop of dread, what the open trunk meant. "You need not come with me, Nell, if you do not wish it," Rhoda was saying low. "My aunt keeps only 2 servants at Ashcombe, and it is a small house, and dull, I dare say, after Veldine. I'll come, my lady, if you're set on going." Nell did not look up from her folding, but her voice had a careful, unhappy flatness to it. "Though I don't understand why you're set on it, if you'll forgive my saying, and neither will his grace, I shouldn't think." "His grace need not be troubled with the reasons." Rhoda's hand went once more to her waist and stayed there this time, pressing flat, as though she were holding something in rather than merely resting. "A visit to my aunt is no great scandal. Wives go to visit their families. It will occasion no remark at all. It'll occasion remark enough, my lady, packing a trunk like it's for a season, and not a fortnight's visit." Rhoda did not answer that, and Ivar, standing in the shadow of the passage with his heart gone entirely still in his chest. Understood two things in the same breath: that his wife meant to leave him, dressed up in the harmless clothing of a family visit, and that whatever she was hiding, for hiding something she plainly was, in the way her hand curved so protectively over her own body. She meant to carry it away from Veldian rather than lay it before him. He should have gone in then. He told himself so 100 times in the days that followed, turning the moment over with the particular cruelty a man reserves for his own worst failures. He should have crossed the threshold and said, before God and Nell and the half-packed trunk, that she was not to go, that whatever she had heard through that door was not the whole truth and never could be. That he loved her past all sense and reckoning, and had said otherwise only to keep a wolf from her door. He had the words ready in his mouth. He had had them ready for days. Instead, he stood a moment longer, watching the candlelight catch the pale curve of her cheek where she had turned it toward the window, watching her hold herself as though she alone stood between some fragile thing and the cold, and something in the sheer private grief of the picture stopped him. A sense that he had already trespassed on a moment not meant for him, that to burst in now, clumsy with his own guilt, would only frighten her further rather than mend anything. He told himself he would speak to her in the morning, when Nell was gone and the trunk was shut, and he could choose his words with more care than the raw ambush of an unlocked door would allow. He withdrew as quietly as he had come, and did not sleep that night either. And in the grey hour before dawn he took out the miniature portrait from his writing table drawer and looked at it a long while by candlelight, the painted eyes so like her living ones, patient and a little wary even in oils. As though the artist had caught something true about her that R himself had only lately learned to see, that she had come to this marriage already braced for disappointment, already schooled by a foolish, loving father's failures to expect that devotion, when it was offered her, would prove thin and conditional in the end. He had meant the portrait as a surprise, a small declaration to be given on some ordinary evening when the moment seemed right. He understood now, turning it in his hands, that he had waited too long for a right moment that did not exist. That there was only ever the moment in front of a man, and he had let 100 of them pass unused while his wife packed 2 floors above him and prepared to vanish into the shape of an ordinary family visit. In the morning he came down early, resolved, and found Hodge waiting at the foot of the stairs with a face carefully arranged into blankness, holding a folded note upon a silver tray. "From Mr. Vane's man, Your Grace," Hodge said, "delivered before first light." He said it was urgent, and that Mr. Vane would call again this forenoon to be answered. Ivar broke the seal and read 4 lines that turned his blood to ice. Vane's soft, insinuating hand informing him that certain parties in town had lately expressed curiosity regarding the swift marriage of the Duke of Veldian, and that a full and interesting account of the late Squire Jocelyn's affairs might be laid before those parties within the week, unless his Grace found it convenient to be considerably more generous than their last conversation had allowed. He crushed the note in his fist and looked up the staircase toward the closed door of his wife's chamber, and understood with a grim and settling certainty that he had run entirely out of time to choose his moment with care. He did not go up to her at once, though every instinct in him strained toward the staircase. He stood in the hall with Vane's crumpled note still hot in his fist, and he made himself think, coldly and carefully, the way his father had taught him long ago to think when a tenant's roof had fallen in or a harvest had failed, and there was no profit in feeling before there was a plan. Vane meant to call that forenoon. Vane would not be put off with soft words a second time, and upstairs his wife had a trunk half packed, and a truth of her own pressed flat beneath her folded hands, and Ivar understood, standing there in the cold morning light of the hall, that whatever he said to her now must be said once and said whole, and that he had no more days left in which to weigh the cost of it. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time and knocked, and did not wait long for her answer before he let himself in. She was standing by the window again, already dressed, her hair pinned with a plainness that told him she had risen early and dressed herself with her own hands rather than ring for Nell, and the trunk behind her stood closed now, corded, ready for the carrier. She turned at the sound of the door, and for one unguarded instant before her composure settled back over her face like a veil drawn down, he saw something raw and frightened in her eyes that undid him more thoroughly than any accusation could have. "Your Grace," she dropped the smallest of curtsies as formal as a stranger, "I did not expect you. You are leaving, for a fortnight, to my aunt at Ashcombe." "I meant to tell you at breakfast." The lie sat awkwardly on her, and he saw her know it even as she said it, and press on regardless, because the alternative was worse. "I have not been well, and the country air there always—" "Rhoda." He said her name the way Anne says a word he has been rationing, and it stopped her. "I know you heard me 4 days past through the study door. I know you have believed something of me since the hour that has near broken you, and I have watched you believe it and said nothing, because I am a coward, and because I made a promise once that I thought mattered more than your peace, and I was wrong. I was entirely wrong, and I will not let you climb into a carriage believing a lie I told to save you, when the lie has done you more harm than the truth I was so certain would destroy you." Her chin came up, that small proud gesture he had come to know in 4 months of marriage, the one she used when she meant to hold herself together by main force. "You need not explain yourself to me, Your Grace. A man may say what he likes of his own feelings, and I have no claim upon—" "You have every claim." He crossed the room to her, close enough now to see the fine tremor in her folded hands. "Rhoda, I said those words to a man named Silas Vane, who held and holds still a note bearing your father's signature, a debt so ruinous that if it were made known in the right rooms, it would not merely embarrass your family, it would destroy what is left to your father's name and yours with it. Your father sent for me on his deathbed, not because we were close friends, but because years ago, when I was a boy of 9, he pulled me from the Ashworth mill pond and never once spoke of it after, and I owed him a debt of my own that I did not know how to repay, and he asked it of me himself. He asked me to marry you. He did not ask me to love you. He was careful, even dying, to say so, because he did not wish to burden a stranger with more than the stranger could honestly give. He asked only that I keep you from Vane, who wanted you for himself, one way or another, marriage or ruin, he did not much care which." She had gone very still, her eyes fixed on his face, and he could not tell from her stillness whether he was mending anything or only tearing it further, but he had begun now and could not stop. "I married you meaning to keep a promise to a dying man, and nothing more. And I will not pretend to you that love was in my thoughts on our wedding day, for it was not. I scarcely knew you then beyond an assembly or two, a few dances, the memory of a girl who laughed at something foolish I said, and did not seem to find me tiresome for saying it. But I have known you 4 months now as I did not know you then, Rhoda. I have watched you manage this house with more grace than my own mother ever troubled to learn. I have watched you write to your father's old tenants with your own hand to see they were not left destitute by his debts. I have watched you sit up half a night with Hodge's granddaughter when she took the fever, a duchess with no earthly reason to trouble herself over a groundsman's grandchild, and somewhere in the watching I stopped keeping a promise and started. He stopped himself and made himself say it plainly the way Constance had told him he must. I started loving you entirely, helplessly. I do not know when it happened, only that it had happened long before Vane sat in my study 4 days ago, and told me that a man who loves his wife openly makes a lever any blackmailer can use against her. He said plainly that if I were known to adore you, he need only threaten to expose your father's shame to see me pay whatever he asked, and asked again without end. I said those 5 words to strip that lever from his hand. I said them to protect you, Rhoda, and I have hated myself every hour since for not foreseeing that they would reach you before the truth of them could. The silence that followed felt to him longer than the whole 4 days that had preceded it. Rhoda's hand had risen at some point in his speaking to press against her mouth, and her eyes had filled, though she did not let the tears fall, holding them back with the same fierce discipline she seemed to bring to everything. "You should have told me," she said at last, low. "Whatever you feared in the telling, Ivar, you should have told me, and let me decide what I could bear, rather than deciding it for me. I know that now. My father," her voice broke on the word, and she pressed her hand harder to her mouth a moment before she could go on. "My father died believing he had ruined me. I have carried that thought for a year and told no one, because I did not think I could bear to have it confirmed by another living soul, and you have carried the proof of it in a desk drawer for 4 months and said nothing. And let me go on believing that at least his name was safe, when it was never safe at all. His name is safe. Ivar took a step nearer, close enough now that he might have touched her had he dared. It has been safe every day since our wedding, and it will go on being safe, because I mean to see Vane answered for good this forenoon, one way or another, and because whatever it costs me, I will not have you carry his shame or my silence for 1 more hour. She looked up at him then, and something in her face had begun, cautiously, to change, the composure cracking not into anger as he had half feared, but into something rawer and more hopeful, though still guarded, still unwilling to trust too quickly what it had been so recently and thoroughly denied. And the 5 words, she said, you meant them as a shield. I meant them as a shield, and instead I used them to wound the one person I most wished to guard. He reached, at last, for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers cold in his. I do not know how to undo 4 days of silence with a single morning's confession, Rhoda, but I will spend as many mornings as you require of me trying, if you will only stay long enough to let me. For a moment he thought she would speak, from the way her lips parted and her free hand drifted, almost without her seeming to notice it, back to the small protective curve over her own waist, that she stood on the very edge of telling him something that had been pressing at her as long as his own secret had pressed at him. But before the words could come, a sharp rap sounded at the chamber door, and Hodge's voice, apologetic and urgent, cut through the moment like a blade. Your Grace, Mr. Vane has come ahead of his hour, and will not be put off. He is in the hall, and, forgive me, Your Grace, he has brought a woman with him, a stranger. She says she has business with Her Grace the Duchess. Rhoda's hand went cold and still in his. Ivar felt the small, fragile thing that had just begun to mend between them shudder under the weight of this new intrusion, and he saw in his wife's face the return, swift and complete, of the same braced, waiting dread he had first seen 4 days outside his study door. Stay here, he told her. Whatever this is, let me go down first. No. She said it with a firmness that surprised him, drawing her hand from his only to smooth her skirts and lift her chin in that same proud gesture, though he saw now, having finally been told the shape of what she carried, that the pride was not coldness but courage hard-won and freshly rediscovered. If Silas Vane has business with me, Your Grace, then I will hear it standing at your side, and not hidden away up here like a thing to be managed. I have been managed and protected and kept in ignorance quite enough this week to last a lifetime. He almost smiled, even with dread cording tight through his chest, for it was entirely the woman he had come these 4 months to love, not delicate, not easily frightened once the fright had a name, but steady under it, the way she had been steady over father's tenants and Hodge's fevered granddaughter, and every other small crisis this house had handed her. He offered his arm, and she took it, and together they went down to the hall to see what new cruelty Silas Vane had thought to bring beneath their roof. The hall was cold with early light when they came down, and Vane stood near the great door with his hat still in his hand, wearing the particular satisfied look of a man who believes he holds every card in a game he has not yet troubled to deal, and beside him, wrapped in a travelling cloak too fine for a servant and too plain for a lady, stood a woman Ivar had never in his life laid eyes upon, dark-haired, sharp-featured, watching Rhoda with an expression that was not quite hostility and not quite anything so simple as pity either, but some complicated mixture of the two that made the hair rise on the back of Ivar's neck before a single word had yet been spoken. Your Grace. Vane's bow was as insolent as ever, but there was something new in his voice this morning, some fresh confidence that told Ivar the man believed he had found at last a card worth more than any note or ledger. Forgive the early hour and the company. I thought Her Grace the Duchess might wish to meet a woman who knew her father rather better in his last years than perhaps Her Grace herself was ever permitted to know him. Rhoda's fingers tightened on Ivar's arm, and the stranger's dark eyes moved slow and deliberate from the Duke's face to the Duchess's and settled there, waiting, with the patience of someone who has rehearsed a cruelty and means to enjoy the delivering of it. Ivar felt Rhoda's grip on his arm go tight enough to whiten her knuckles through her glove, and he laid his own hand over hers, a small steadying pressure, before he addressed the stranger directly rather than Vane. For he had learned enough of Vane's methods in these last months to know the man liked best to watch others do his cruelty for him while he stood by looking innocent of it. "You have the advantage of us, madam," he said. "You know our names. We do not yet know yours." Sophie Layton. The woman's voice was quieter than her sharp features had led him to expect, and there was something in it, a thinness, a fraying at the edges, that did not sit easily with the confident cruelty Vane's introduction had promised. "I knew your father, your grace. That is, I knew the squire in his last 2 years. He was kind to me when few enough others were. Kind to her," Vane put in smoothly, "is one way of naming it. There are other ways, I think, that her grace's fine neighbours would find considerably more diverting to discuss over their tea." "That is not true." Sophie Layton turned on him with a suddenness that seemed to surprise even Vane, 2 spots of colour rising high on her thin cheeks. "You told me he would pay me what I am owed if I came and said what you wished me to say. You did not tell me I must stand in this hall and let a lie be dressed up as though it were mine." The hall had gone very quiet. Ivar felt Rhoda's hand loosen, very slightly, on his arm, some tension in her easing, not because the danger had passed, but because she had heard, as clearly as he had, the crack in the performance Vane had brought to his own doorstep. "Madam," Ivar said more gently now, "will you tell us plainly what passed between you and the squire, without Mr. Vane's assistance in the telling?" Sophie Layton's eyes went to Vane once, quick and frightened, and then away from him, toward Rhoda, and something in her face gentled when it found the Duchess's, some recognition perhaps of a woman as cornered by circumstance as she herself had been. "My husband served under Colonel Ashworth, your grace, and died at it, in the Peninsula, 3 years since, and left me with nothing but his name and a daughter of 5 years old to feed. I had no family left to go to. I came to this parish because I had heard the squire was a generous man, and I was not wrong in it. He gave me work mending linens for the house, more than I could rightly do in the hours he paid me for, and when the work ran out he went on paying regardless, and told me not to speak of it to anyone, for he said a proud woman does not thank a man for pity, and he did not wish me to feel I owed him thanks I could not easily give." She stopped and pressed her lips together, and Eva saw that whatever composure she had walked in with was fraying further with every word, as though the truth, once begun, could not now be stopped by anything so small as her own fear of Vane. "He meant to settle something on me properly before he died, a small sum, enough to see my girl educated and myself independent of charity, and he told me so near the end, and then he died before the papers could be drawn, and I have had nothing since but what I can earn with my needle, which is little enough in a hard winter. Mr. Vane found me some months back. He knew, somehow, that the squire had helped me, and he told me that if I came and said certain things, that the squire had been more than kind to me, that there had been an understanding between us of an improper nature, he would see I was paid what I was, in his words, still owed. I did not to say it. I have said it to no one until this hour, and I would not have come at all, only I am very near to losing the room I let for myself and my girl, and I have grown desperate enough, God forgive me, to let a bad man's money look better than it is." Rhoda released Ivar's arm entirely and crossed the few steps of cold marble to where Sophie Layton stood, and took the woman's hands in both her own, ungloved, without the smallest hesitation. And Ivar watched his wife do it with a swell of feeling in his chest that had nothing at all to do with Vane or debts or the wreckage of the last 4 days, and everything to do with the plain fact of who she was. "My father spoke of no such understanding to me," Rhoda said, "but I do not doubt a word of what you have told me of his kindness, for it was entirely his way, and I am glad past telling, to learn he did some good in his last years that I did not know of, rather than only the debts I have spent a year grieving over. You owe Mr. Vane nothing, Mrs. Layton, and you shall not lose your room, whatever it costs to see that you do not, for my father meant to see you settled, and he shall be obeyed in it, a year late and by another hand, but obeyed none the less." Vane's composure, which had held admirably through his own instruments unravelling, cracked at last into something uglier. "Your grace will forgive me if I do not stand by and watch my evidence walk itself out of the room. I have a note bearing the squire's signature, and figures that will bear scrutiny however her grace chooses to soften the telling of it, and I will have what I am owed from this house, one way or another, whatever sentimental scene her ladyship chooses to play at. You will have nothing further from this house, Ivar said, and something in his voice must have carried a weight it had not carried in their previous meetings, for Vane's eyes flickered, the first true uncertainty Ivar had seen in him. I paid you once already, Mr. Vane, against my own better judgment, because I believed at the time that silence was the only shield my wife's peace could stand behind. I have learned this week that silence protects nothing and no one, least of all the people we tell ourselves we are protecting by it. So let us have this plainly before witnesses, since you are so fond of an audience. You hold a note. Produce it, and let my man of business examine it, for I begin to wonder, given the quality of the other evidence you have brought me this morning, whether the figures upon it are quite so honest as you have represented them. For the first time since Ivar had known him, Silas Vane hesitated. It was a small thing, a fractional stillness, a tightening about the mouth, but Ivar had spent enough years reading men across a card table and negotiating desk alike to know the shape of a bluff beginning to buckle, and he pressed the advantage before it could recover itself. I have already sent word this morning to Mr. Pryor, my man of business, asking him to make discreet inquiry into your affairs, Mr. Vane. Since it occurred to me some weeks ago that a man so free with threats against an old debt might himself have debts of his own that would not bear close examination, I expect his report within the week. I wonder whether you would care to wait for it under this roof, or whether you would rather take your leave now and spare yourself the embarrassment of having your own ledgers read aloud in a magistrate's hearing, the way you have so often threatened to have mine read aloud in a drawing-room. It was not, in truth, entirely honest. Ivar had sent no such letter that morning, though he resolved, standing there, to send it within the hour, for the bluff he was laying down was one he meant to make true before the day was out. But he had learned, watching Vane these past months, that the man's power lay entirely in the fear of exposure he could inspire in others, and that a man who trades in that particular coin is seldom prepared to have it traded back against him. Vane's jaw worked once, and his eyes went to Sophie Layton, who had drawn herself up beside Rhoda with a new, borrowed steadiness, and then to the note still folded in his breast pocket, and something in his calculation visibly shifted. The confidence of a man certain of his cards giving way to the caution of a man who has begun too late to suspect he has been dealt a losing hand after all. You will regret this, your grace, he said, but the threat had gone thin, more habit than conviction. I will have what is owed me, one way or another, and sooner than you think. You will have a summons, Mr. Vane, if you are still within 10 miles of this house by nightfall, and I will see to it personally that every man of business from here to London hears the particulars of how you conduct your affairs. Ivar's voice had gone very quiet, which Hodge, standing rigid by the door, seemed to understand was more dangerous than any shout. For the old butler moved at once to open the great door wide, a silent, eloquent invitation. Vane went. He did not bow this time, and he did not look back, and the sound of his boots on the gravel drive faded into the ordinary morning quiet of the house with a swiftness that felt, to Ivar, almost anticlimactic after 4 days of dread, though he knew, even as the relief loosened something tight in his chest, that a man like Vane did not simply vanish because he had been outfaced once in a hole. There would be more to answer for, papers to examine, perhaps a magistrate's involvement before the matter was fully closed, but the immediate danger, the danger that had stood in his own front hall not 5 minutes past, had retreated, and for the moment that was enough to breathe by. He turned to find Rhoda still holding Sophie Layton's hands, speaking to her low and quick, an invitation to stay the night, to send for her daughter, to let the household see her fed and warmed before any further arrangements were made, and the sight of it. His wife's whole attention bent so entirely, and so naturally toward a stranger's comfort even in the wreck of her own mourning, struck him with a tenderness so sharp it was very near to pain. "Hodge," he said, "see that Mrs. Layton and her daughter are given the blue room and whatever else they require. Send a man for the girl directly." "At once, your grace." Hodge's face, for once, betrayed something very near approval before he schooled it back to its customary blankness and went to see the thing done. It was some while later, the household settled into its new and unexpected arrangements. The Ivar found Rhoda alone at last in the morning room, standing near the cold hearth with her arms wrapped about herself in the old, familiar gesture, though something in the set of her shoulders had eased since the hall. Some weight lifted that he did not think Vane's departure alone could account for. "You did not have to offer her a home under this roof," he said, coming to stand near her, not touching her yet, uncertain still of how much ground the morning had truly won him. "A sum of money would have answered it as well, and cost you less trouble. It would have answered Mr. Vane's grievance." She turned to face him, and her eyes, he saw, had lost some of the guarded distance of the last 4 days, though they were not yet entirely free of it either. "It would not have answered hers. She has spent a year believing herself a woman with nothing to offer but a lie for hire, Ivar, because that is what desperation does to a person. It teaches them to think less of themselves than they deserve. I know something of what that teaches a person to believe of late." The words landed exactly where she meant them to land, and he did not flinch from them. "I have been thinking, all this last hour, of how to say what I did not finish saying before Hodge interrupted us." "You said a great deal already." "Not all of it." He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, not fear now, he thought, but something more like a woman deciding whether she has courage enough to hope again after 4 days spent teaching herself not to, she put her own into it. "I told you I did not love you on our wedding day, and that was true, and I told you I love you now, past all sense, and that is true also. What I have not told you is that I have known it for some weeks longer than I have said it, and that I commissioned a portrait of you near a month ago, meant as a gift, and have kept it in a drawer since because I could never find what seemed the right evening to give it, and told myself there would always be another evening, until I very nearly lost the chance to give it at all." A portrait. Something flickered across her face, half surprise and half a rueful, aching sort of tenderness. "You are a strange man, Ivar of Veldine. You would rather commission a painting and hide it in a drawer for a month than simply tell a woman to her face that you have come to love her. I am learning that hiding things in drawers serves no one, however well-intentioned the hiding." He drew her hand up and pressed his lips to it, and felt her fingers tremble against his mouth. "I will bring it to you tonight, if you will let me, and I will not hide anything else from you again, whatever the cost of the telling, that I swear to you, before God and this house and whatever remains of Silas Vane's ambitions." She was silent a long moment, studying his face as though she meant to memorize it, or perhaps only to satisfy herself that what she saw there was as true as it appeared, and then, very quietly, she said, "There is something I have not told you either, Ivar, and I think the time for hiding things in drawers is past for both of us." His chest tightened, some instinct warning him that whatever came next would matter more than anything Vane or Sophie Layton had brought to his door that morning. But before she could go further, a soft, urgent knock sounded at the morning room door, and Nell's voice, breathless and unmistakably frightened, called through it, "Your Grace, my lady, forgive me, but you must come. It's Mrs. Layton's girl. She's took a fright on the road and won't stop crying for her mamma, and Mrs. Layton's gone quite pale and can't seem to stand, and I've sent for Dr. Whitlock, but I don't know what else to do." Rhoda's hand tightened once hard in Ivar's, and whatever she had been about to confess folded itself away again, unspoken, as she turned toward the door with the same swift, unthinking readiness to another's trouble that had first drawn him to her, months before he had understood what he was drawing toward. They found the child in the small parlor off the entrance hall, a girl of perhaps 8 years with her mother's sharp dark eyes gone wide and streaming, clutching at Nell's skirts with the particular terror of a small creature set down in a strange place after a long, frightening journey, while Sophie Layton herself sat ashen in a chair nearby, one hand pressed to her own brow, plainly on the point of swooning from nothing more, Ivar judged at a glance, than exhaustion, hunger, and the release of a fear she had been carrying too long to set down all at once without some cost to her body. Rhoda crossed the room and knelt directly on the parlor floor before the child, heedless of her own fine skirts against the boards, and spoke to her in a low, even voice that seemed to Ivar, watching from the doorway, to carry some particular skill born of long practice with frightened things. "The tenant's children, perhaps, or Hodge's granddaughter in her fever, or some gentler instinct he had not yet had cause to see so plainly on display. "You have had a very long morning," Rhoda said, "and I think you must be tired past all bearing, and hungry besides, and there is nothing at all wrong in crying about it. But your mother is quite safe here, and so are you, and no one in this house means either of you the smallest harm, whatever unkind men may have told you to frighten you on the road." The girl's sobs did not stop at once, but they slowed, hiccuping, and after a moment she allowed herself to be drawn into Rhoda's arms, small fists still knotted in the fine silk of the Duchess's gown, and Ivar felt something turn over entirely in his chest at the sight of it. His wife, still in her morning dress, kneeling on a hard floor with a stranger's frightened child pressed against her, offering comfort as naturally as breathing, and he thought, not for the first time that week, that he had married a woman of a finer make than he had known enough, 4 months past, to properly value. Dr. Whitlock arrived within the half-hour, a brisk, grey-whiskered man who had attended the Veldean household for the better part of 20 years and had, in that time, developed a manner that managed to be both entirely respectful of rank and entirely indifferent to it when a patient required plain speaking. He examined Sophie Layton first, pronounced her sound but badly worn down by want and worry, prescribed rest and good food in quantities that made Ivar resolve on the spot to see both provided without stint, and turned his attention next to the child, who had by then been coaxed into a bowl of bread and milk by the housekeeper and had stopped crying entirely, absorbed in the novel comfort of a warm kitchen. It was as the doctor was gathering his things to go that Rhoda, who had remained standing near the parlour door through the whole of the examination, swayed suddenly on her feet, one hand flying out to catch the door frame, her face gone the colour of old linen. Ivar was across the room before he had entirely decided to move, catching her by the shoulders before her knees could give further, and Dr. Whitlock turned from his bag with the swift, unhurried competence of a man who has seen 100 fainting women and does not intend to be flustered by 101st. "Sit her down, your grace, head low. That's it, do not fuss her with smelling salts yet, let her breathe a moment first." He crouched beside the chair into which Ivar had lowered her, taking her wrist between his fingers with a professional gentleness. "Her grace has had rather too much excitement for one morning, I should think, on top of whatever else has been keeping her from her food and her sleep this last week." "I am quite well," Rhoda said, though her voice was thin and her colour had not yet returned, and she would not meet Ivar's eyes, which frightened him more than the faint itself had done. "It is only the shock of the morning. I have not eaten properly." "No," Dr. Whitlock agreed mildly, still holding her wrist, his gaze gone thoughtful in a way that made Ivar's stomach clench with a dread he could not yet name. "I do not imagine you have, in some little while, your grace." This to Ivar, though his eyes stayed on Rhoda, watching her face with the particular patient attention of a man waiting to see whether a patient will speak first or must be spoken for. "Might I have a private word with the Duchess?" Ivar felt something cold settle in him, some old, half-forgotten fear that a swooning woman meant illness of the gravest sort, that he might lose her to some fever or wasting complaint before he had even finished mending what 4 days of silence had broken between them, and he did not want to leave her. Did not think he could bear to be sent from the room not knowing, but Rhoda's hand found his own where it still rested on the arm of her chair and pressed it, once, with a strange, fragile steadiness that was almost, he thought afterward, closer to courage gathering itself than to fear. "You need not send him away, Dr. Whitlock," she said low. "Whatever you have guessed, I think he had better hear it from you now, since I have been a coward about the telling of it myself for rather longer than I ought." The doctor's eyebrows rose a fraction, some understanding passing over his weathered face, and he sat back on his heels and regarded them both with the careful, almost tender briskness of a man about to deliver news he suspects will be welcome, whatever complications have attended its arrival. "Your Grace," he said to Ivar, "I have attended a good many duchesses and squires' wives and farmers' wives in 20 years in this parish, and I have learned to recognize the signs of a particular condition well before the lady herself always chooses to name it. Her Grace is with child. Some 6 weeks along, by my reckoning, perhaps a little more, and the faintness, the want of appetite, the low spirits you have nout remarked this last week, These are none of them mysterious, your grace, not to a man who has seen them 1,000 times before. I should say she is in good health for it, given proper rest and food from this hour forward, but she has plainly been driving herself past what her condition can well bear, and I would have her in her bed within the hour and kept there, gently, for the remainder of the day at the least. For a moment Ivar could not speak at all. The words arranged themselves in his mind slowly, as though they had come to him in some language he must translate before he could trust himself to have understood them rightly. With child, 6 weeks, a little more, and then all at once. Understanding broke over him entire, and with it a flood of feelings so large and so tangled that he could not at first sort love from grief, from wonder, from a raw, retroactive horror at everything. He now understood his silence, and his 5 foolish words must have cost her. 6 weeks, he said, and heard his own voice come out rough. Rhoda, you have known this how long? Since before you spoke to Mr. Vane. Her eyes had filled at last, the tears she had held back so fiercely through 4 whole days finally slipping free, though she did not look away from him, meeting his gaze with a rawness that undid whatever composure he had left. I meant to tell you that very morning, Ivar. I had dressed early and come down to find you before you rode out, because I could not bear to keep it to myself another hour, and I stood outside your study door working up the courage, foolishly, with a piece of needlework in my hands that I meant to give you along with the news, a small thing, a beginning of something for the child, though it was scarcely more than a few stitches yet. And then I heard you say you did not love me, and I could not go in and tell you. After that I was carrying your child, I thought you would feel yourself trapped, bound to a woman and now a child besides, out of duty rather than any wish of your own, and I could not bear to watch your face try to be glad of it when I believed you could not truly be. Dr. Whitlock, with the tact of long practice, had risen and withdrawn quietly to the far side of the room, occupying himself with the clasps of his bag and giving them, as much as the small parlour allowed, the privacy of 2 people who had a great deal more to say to each other than any third party ought to overhear. Ivar sank onto his knees beside her chair, heedless of dignity, and took both her hands in his, pressing them to his lips and then to his own chest, over the hard, unsteady beat of his heart. I found the linen, he said, the scrap you dropped outside the door. I have kept it in a drawer since, not knowing what it meant, only that it seemed too fine and too careful a thing for you to have abandoned without cause, and I turned it over 100 times this last week wondering what I had lost without knowing I had lost it. A vine, she said, half laughing, half weeping. It was meant to be a vine, worked round a little cap, though I had scarcely begun it. I am not so very skilled with a needle when my hands are shaking. Rhoda. He said her name again, because he did not seem able to stop saying it, as though the repetition might somehow anchor the enormity of what he had nearly thrown away through 4 days of cowardly silence. You carried this alone. You carried my child and my father's grief and Silas Vane's threats all together, alone, because I gave you 5 words to believe instead of the truth I ought to have trusted you with from the first hour. I do not deserve the grace of hearing this news from your own mouth rather than a stranger's, and yet you have given it to me anyway, and I will spend the whole of my life trying to prove myself worthy of having received it. You are proving it already. She freed one hand from his to touch his face, her thumb brushing along the hard line of his jaw, with a tenderness that made his throat close entirely. You stood in that hall this morning, and would not let Silas Vane so much as finish a threat before you had outfaced him. You knelt on the floor of your own house with a stranger's frightened child not an hour past. No, do not look surprised. I saw you watching from the door, Ivar, and I saw your face while you watched. You are not the cold, dutiful man those 5 words made me fear you were. You never were. I think I knew it within a month of our marriage and was only too frightened, after my father's failures, to let myself trust it fully until I had no choice left but to trust it or lose you. He rose enough to gather her carefully against him, mindful now of Dr. Whitlock's instructions in a way that made him almost laugh at himself. This sudden new fierce carefulness settling over him like a second skin he had not known an hour before, that he possessed, a father's carefulness. Though the words still sat strange and enormous in his chest, too new yet to be worn easily. I will not let 5 words undo 4 months again. he said against her hair. Whatever comes, Vane, or my mother's opinions, or the whole watching county, I will say what is true to you first and always, Rhoda, before I say it to any other soul living, and I will go on saying it until you have no call left to doubt it. Dr. Whitlock cleared his throat gently from across the room. Her Grace to bed, your Grace, if you can bring yourself to release her long enough to see it done. There will be time enough for the rest of this, and I dare say a great deal more of it, in the coming months, once she has had food and rest and is not swaying on her feet from an empty stomach and an emptied heart both at once. Ivar laughed then, an unsteady, overfull sound he had not expected of himself, and lifted Rhoda bodily from the chair despite her soft protest that she was entirely capable of walking, and carried her up the stairs himself past a startled Hodge and a wide-eyed Nell, and laid her in her own bed with a gentleness that felt, to him, like the truest vow he had yet made her, truer even than the ones spoken before a clergyman 4 months past, because this one he made with his whole understanding heart rather than a stranger's borrowed sense of duty. He sat with her until she slept, her hand curled loosely in his, and only then did he rise and go to his writing table, and take from its drawer both the scrap of green-threaded linen and the small oval portrait he had kept hidden there so long, and set them both upon her pillow beside her, so that when she woke she would find them waiting. The beginning of one gift and the whole of another, no longer hidden in any drawer, no longer waiting for a right evening that he understood now would never come by waiting, only by choosing again and again to speak the truth of his heart the moment it was true, rather than a fortnight or a month or a lifetime after. Below in the hall he found Mr. Prior newly arrived and waiting with his hat still in hand, summoned by the letter Ivar had, true to his word, sent within the hour of Vane's departure. And it was with something very near to relish that the Duke of Veldean sat down at last to lay before his man of business the whole particular, ugly history of Silas Vane's dealings, and to set in motion the ruin of a man who had very nearly cost him, through 5 careless words and a moneylender's cunning, the 2 people he had only just discovered he could not imagine his life continuing without. Mr. Prior came within 4 days rather than the week Ivar had promised Vane, for the man of business, once set loose upon a scent, proved a hound of considerable skill and no small satisfaction in the hunting. Silas Vane, it transpired, was no gentleman of independent means come honestly by his trade, as he had always given the county to understand, but a former clerk to a firm of London attorneys, dismissed some 6 years past for the falsifying of accounts, who had since made his uncertain living travelling from county to county wherever a foolish squire's debts or a dying man's carelessness might be turned, with patience and a forger's steady hand, into something considerably more profitable than the original sum owed. The note bearing Squire Jocelyn's signature, examined by Mr. Prior alongside 3 genuine letters of the squire's own hand that Rhoda still kept among her father's effects, proved on close comparison to be a clumsier thing than Vane's confidence had ever allowed either of them to suspect. The true debt, whatever it had originally been, inflated by a careful hand into a sum 4 times its honest size, with a final clause added in ink demonstrably newer than the rest of the document, a clause that transformed an ordinary, forgivable debt of a foolish country gentleman into something that read, to an unpractised eye, very near to a confession of ruinous and shameful conduct. A forgery, your Grace, and not even a particularly clever one, once a man knows to look for the seams of it, Mr. Prior said, laying the paper and his findings before Ivar in the study, the same room, Ivar noted grimly, in which the whole business had begun, with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman presenting well done. I have taken the liberty of showing it under confidence to a magistrate of my acquaintance in the county town, who agrees the matter warrants a warrant, if your Grace will forgive the poor jest. Mr. Vane has not been seen at his lodgings these 3 days past. I expect he had some warning of my inquiries and has removed himself to safer ground, as such men generally do when the ground beneath them grows too hot for comfort. Let him run, then, so long as he runs from this county and does not trouble to return to it, Ivar said, though something in him, some old instinct toward finishing a fight rather than watching an enemy slip its leash, chafed at the thought of Vane escaping any true reckoning for what he had cost this house. See the warrant issued regardless, Prior, and let it follow him wherever he goes. I want it known, in every county he might think to try his trade in next, that the Duke of Veldian's name is not one to be trifled with by forgers and blackmailers, and that any man who does so will find the law considerably less patient with him than I have been. It shall be done, your grace. Prior gathered his papers, and paused at the door with the particular delicacy of a servant of long standing who has heard, through the usual channels a great house cannot entirely keep from its staff, news he was not officially privy to. May I say, your grace, that the household is very glad of the news regarding her grace. It has done a great deal to lighten the mood below stairs this week, after a rather trying fortnight, if your grace will permit the observation. You may say it, Prior, and I will not pretend I do not deserve the observation attached to it. Ivar allowed himself a rare, rueful smile. I have learned rather more about the cost of poor communication these past days than any man of my age and supposed sense ought to require teaching in. Rhoda kept to her bed only 2 days before Dr. Whitlock, satisfied with the return of her colour and her appetite, pronounced her fit to resume a gentler version of her ordinary life, and it was on the 3rd morning, with the household settling once more into a rhythm undisturbed by moneylenders or midnight packing, that the Dowager Duchess sought Ivar out in the library with an expression he had learned, across a lifetime, to recognize as the particular blend of triumph and vindication his mother reserved for occasions when events had proven her right about something she had never troubled to voice aloud until she could do so with maximum effect. So, she said, settling herself into the chair opposite his with the deliberate care of a woman who intended a long conversation, I understand I am to be a grandmother. You are, madam, and I would ask that whatever satisfaction you take in the news, you take it gently around Rhoda for the present. She has had a difficult fortnight, and I would not have her fret over your opinions on top of everything else she has borne. I am aware she has had a difficult fortnight, Ivar, though I confess I did not understand the shape of it until Constance was good enough to explain a good deal of it to me yesterday, in rather blunter terms than I generally care to hear used of my own son's conduct. The dowager's mouth thinned, though there was less censure in it than Ivar had braced for, and more of something that might, in a woman less determined to preserve her dignity at all costs, have passed for guilt. I will own I did not make her welcome here as I ought to have done those first weeks. I thought the marriage rushed, and beneath you, whatever debt of honour you claim to owe her father, and I said as much to her once or twice in ways I am not proud to recall now. I did not think a squire's daughter, however pretty, had the steel to manage a house of this size and history. She has managed it a great deal better than you predicted, madam. She has managed it a great deal better than I could have done at her age, and I will tell her so myself, if it will ease anything between us. The dowager rose, smoothing her skirts, and paused at the door with a rare, unguarded softness crossing her handsome aging face. I was hard on her, Ivar, because I did not think love had any proper place in a match made for duty, and I had rather she armoured herself against disappointment early than hope for a warmth. I did not believe you capable of offering a wife you had married for a dead man's sake, rather than your own heart's choosing. I see now I was wrong on every count, and I do not say that easily, so you will forgive me if I do not care to say it twice. He watched her go with something like wonder, his mother admitting fault, however briskly and however determined to have the admission over and done with as quickly as possible, and thought not for the first time that week that the last fortnight had shaken loose more honest feeling in this house, buried and unspoken across years of careful, dutiful reserve, than the whole of the 4 months preceding it. He found Rhoda that afternoon in the Succession House among his mother's roses, a shawl about her shoulders against the mild autumn chill, sitting on the stone bench with a book open on her lap that she was not reading. And when he came to sit beside her she closed it without ceremony and turned her face up to his with an ease that still struck him, each time he saw it, as a small miracle recovered from the wreckage of a week ago. "Sophie Layton leaves for the Dower Cottage at Ashford tomorrow," she said. She wept when I told her of it, the position as housekeeper there, and the girl to be taught her letters properly at last, and a roof that owes nothing to any man's charity but stands as honest wages for honest work. I do not think she believed, a week ago, that such a thing could still happen to a woman in her circumstance. You arranged all of it yourself, I understand, with scarcely a word to me until it was settled. I did not think you would object. A small testing smile, still not entirely free of the old worriness, though it faded quickly as he took her hand. Was I wrong to arrange it without asking? You were entirely right to arrange it, and I hope you will go on arranging such things without asking me. Rhoda, for you have a truer sense than I do of what kindness is owed where, and I would rather learn to trust your judgment freely than have you come to me, cap in hand, for permission to be generous in your own house. He turned her hand over in his and pressed his lips to the soft inside of her wrist, feeling her pulse quicken beneath his mouth. I spoke to my mother this morning. She means to apologize to you, in her own fashion, which I am given to understand will be brisk and delivered once only, but sincerely meant beneath the briskness. I had noticed a change in her manner at breakfast. I confess I did not know what to make of it. Rhoda's gaze drifted toward the glass panes of the Succession House, beyond which the gardens stretched pale gold in the autumn light. It has been a strange fortnight, Ivar. I do not think I shall ever hear a closed door again without some small remembered dread of what might be said behind it. Then I will make you a promise to set against that dread, and I mean to keep it more faithfully than I kept my silence these past days. He waited until she turned back to him before he went on. I will never again let 5 words, or 500, stand unspoken between us, where a hard truth wants telling. If I am ever tempted to guard you from something by hiding it, you have my leave, my earnest request, Rhoda, to march directly into whatever room I am hiding in and demand the whole of it from me, door or no door, company or no company. She laughed then, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, the first he had heard from her in what felt an age, though it had been scarcely a fortnight, and the sound of it eased something in his chest that had not fully unclenched since he had first heard her breath catch beyond the study door. I shall hold you to that, your grace, and I warn you I have every intention of being a very inconvenient wife about it from this day forward. I would have you no other way. He drew her carefully against his side, mindful still of the new, tender carefulness Dr. Whitlock's news had settled into him, and for a long while they sat together among the dormant roses in silence that asked nothing further of either of them, a silence entirely unlike the wary, closed silence of the last fortnight, this one warm and full and shared. It was Rhoda who broke it at last, her hand finding his where it rested against her waist, over the small, secret shape of the life they had made together. Ivar, I have been thinking, since Dr. Whitlock's news, of what we ought to name her, if she is a girl or him if a boy, though I suppose it is dreadfully early yet to be settling such things. It is never too early, I think, to imagine what we are building toward. He covered her hand with his own. Have you a preference? If a girl, I thought. I do not know if you will think it fanciful. I thought perhaps for my father. Edwina for Edmund. He would have liked, I think, to know some small part of his name carried on in a grandchild he never had the chance to meet, especially now that his memory need not be shadowed by the dyed, fearing would ruin us both. Edwina. Ivar turned the name over, tasting it, and found it good. And if a boy? She hesitated, a faint color rising in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. I had thought, perhaps, though you may object, and I shall not press it if you do, I had thought of your own father's name, since you have told me so little of him, and I think you loved him a great deal, even in the little you have said. Something tightened in Ivar's throat, unexpected and entire. You would give our son my father's name, when you have known me scarcely 4 months and buried your own father not a year past, carrying grief enough of your own without troubling to carry mine as well. I would give him whatever name binds this family's grief and its hope together in the same breath, Ivar, for I think that is rather what a family is, not the absence of sorrow, but the choosing again and again to build something warm out of it. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears that were not, this time, the tears of the last fortnight's ache, but something gentler, fuller, entirely her own to give. I did not think 6 weeks ago that I would ever say such a thing to you and mean it so completely. I am glad to have been wrong. He kissed her then, slow and careful and entirely unhurried, They're among his mother's dormant roses with the pale autumn light falling gold across them both, and understood with a certainty that settled into him like something long sought and finally, fully found. That whatever Silas Vane had meant to break with his forged papers and his cunning threats, he had instead in the end only hastened the hour at which husband and wife stopped guarding themselves from one another and began, at last, to build in earnest. Word came from Mr. Pryor, near the close of that same month, that Silas Vane had been taken up at last in a coaching in outside Bristol, attempting to work some lesser version of his old trade upon a merchant's widow who had proved, fortunately for herself, and unfortunately for Vane, considerably more suspicious of smooth-tongued strangers than the Jocelyn family's grief and debt had left them capable of being. The magistrate's warrant had caught up with him there, and the forged note, laid alongside 3 others of similar manufacture found among his effects, had been evidence enough to see him committed for trial on charges that would keep him from troubling any other grieving family for a good many years to come, whatever the court's final sentence proved to be. Ivar told Rhoda the news himself. Seeking her out in the little sitting room she had lately taken to using of a morning, where the light fell kindest and the chair by the window had been fitted, at her own quiet insistence, with a cushion soft enough to ease the ache that had begun these past weeks to settle now and again in her back. "It is finished then," she said, when he had told her the whole of it, and he watched some last, small tension go out of her shoulders that he had not fully realized she still carried until he saw it leave. "I confess I had not thought I should feel so little triumph in it, after everything. I had expected to feel something fiercer. What do you feel instead?" She considered the question with the same careful honesty she brought to everything, her hand resting, as it so often did now, lightly over the gentle curve that had begun, these last weeks, to show itself beneath her gowns. Relief mostly, and a kind of tiredness with the whole business, as though I have set down a weight I did not fully know how heavy it had grown until it was gone. I do not think I shall waste much more feeling on Silas Vane. He has had quite enough of my thought already, and I find I would rather spend what thought I have left on happier matters. A wise philosophy, and one I mean to adopt myself. He came and knelt beside her chair, as had become his habit these last weeks, whenever he found her sitting quiet in the morning light, and laid his hand over hers where it rested against the small life growing beneath it. Sophie Layton writes that the girl has taken to her letters faster than she dared hope, and asks to be remembered to you with more warmth than I think she has troubled to show any duchess in her life before this one. I am glad of it. Rhoda's smile, unguarded Nan away it had not been in those first hard weeks of their marriage, nor even in the earlier days before the whole business with Vane had cracked something open between them that neither had quite known how to reach before, warmed something in him that he suspected would never entirely stop feeling new. I had a letter from my aunt at Ashcombe as well, wondering rather pointedly why I never came to visit her after all, and I confess I have not yet found the courage to explain the whole of why my plans changed so abruptly, tell her the truth, that her niece discovered, in the space of a single remarkable morning, that her husband loved her considerably more than either of them had thought to hope for on her wedding day, and that a fortnight's visit seemed, after that, a poor use of her time when there was a home worth staying in instead. You make it sound a very simple thing, put that way. It became simple once I stopped being a coward about the saying of it. He pressed his lips to her knuckles, lingering there. I have not thanked you properly, I think, for staying to hear the whole of it that morning, rather than climbing into the carriage before I found the courage to knock upon your door. You had every reason to go. I gave you 5 words and 4 days of silence, and you might easily have decided that neither I nor Veldine deserved a second chance at better. I nearly did go. Her honesty always disarmed him more thoroughly than any softer answer could have. I had the trunk corded and the carriage very nearly ordered, but some part of me, I think, wanted to be wrong about you, Ivar, more than it wanted to be safely, comfortably right in its unhappiness. I had grown so used, watching my father, to expecting disappointment from the men I loved that I think I had half convinced myself I ought to leave before you could disappoint me further and prove the expectation true. It was pride as much as hurt that packed that trunk. I am glad now that some stubborner, Hopeful a part of me held the carriage back long enough for you to knock. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm gentler than any Ivar had known since his own boyhood. Before his father's death had laid the whole weight of Veldian across shoulders too young, he had often thought since to carry it with any real grace. Rhoda's strength returned by steady degrees, her appetite with it, until Dr. Whitlock pronounced himself entirely satisfied with her progress and warned only, with a dry humour Ivar had come to appreciate, that a duchess in her condition ought not to spend quite so much of her recovered vigour chasing Hodge's granddaughter about the succession house, however much the child's laughter seemed to do her good. The county, which had whispered a great deal in the first weeks of the hasty marriage and whispered again, with rather more malice, when word of Silas Vane's dealings had inevitably leaked into the general gossip despite every effort at discretion, found itself obliged by autumn's end to whisper something altogether different, for the Duke of Veldian, never before remarked upon as a man given to public sentiment, had taken to appearing at every assembly and dinner and church service with his wife's hand tucked visibly, unmistakably, into the crook of his arm, and a manner toward her so plainly, tenderly attentive that even the sharpest tongues in 3 parishes found themselves, within a month, obliged to concede that whatever had first brought the match about, love had very thoroughly finished the business. Lady Ashworth's autumn ball, held each year at the great house that had given the parish assemblies of Ivar's boyhood their name, provided the occasion of the season's most talked-of proof. Rhoda, 6 months gone by then and glowing with a health and confidence that made her, Ivar thought privately and said aloud rather more than his wife found strictly comfortable, the handsomest woman in any room she entered, had hesitated over attending at all, uncertain whether the county's curiosity about her condition and her history alike might prove more than she cared to face in company. "You need not go if you would rather not," Ivar told her, dressing that evening with more care than he generally troubled to give his cravat, for he had determined, whatever her final decision, to make the evening as easy for her as it lay in his power to make it. "I will send our regrets, and no one will think the worse of it." "No." Rhoda turned from her glass, where Nell had just finished pinning the last curl into place, and regarded him with the particular steady resolve he had learned, these past months, to recognize as her truest self coming forward. "I have spent a great deal of this year being managed and protected out of rooms I had every right to stand in, Ivar, by well-meaning men who thought silence kinder than truth. I find I have had quite enough of it. Let the county look and whisper what it likes. I mean to walk into that ballroom on your arm and let them see precisely how little either of us cares for old gossip, and precisely how much we have built since the gossip began." He offered his arm at the foot of the stairs with something very near to pride swelling in his chest. And when they entered Lady Ashworth's ballroom together, Rhoda in deep blue silk that became her condition rather than concealed it, her chin high and her hand steady on his sleeve, he felt the room's attention turn toward them in a wave, felt the old familiar hush of speculation gathering, and watched it break, within a handful of minutes, against the plain and undeniable evidence of how he looked at her, how he bent his head to catch her low remarks, how his hand found the small of her back with a possessive tenderness no man troubles to counterfeit for an audience he does not particularly respect. "Your Grace," Lady Ashworth herself, a formidable dowager of the old school whose good opinion had taken Ivar's own mother the better part of a decade to fully secure, came to greet them with a warmth that surprised him. "I confess I did not expect to see you so soon in your condition, my dear, but I am very glad of it. There has been entirely too much idle talk this autumn about matters that were, by every account I have since had the good sense to credit, none of the county's proper business to begin with. I am glad to see the Duke of Veldian set so fine an example of how a gentleman ought to stand by his wife, whatever cruel tongues would make of her circumstances." "You are very kind, Lady Ashworth," Rhoda said, and Ivar heard, beneath the polished courtesy of it, a genuine warmth that told him the old dowager's regard mattered to her more than she would ever trouble to admit aloud. "Kindness has nothing to do with it, my dear. I have eyes, and I have used them tonight to good purpose." Lady Ashworth's gaze moved between them with a shrewdness that missed very little. "I have buried one husband who thought duty and devotion two entirely separate obligations, to be discharged in separate coin, And I have watched a great many marriages made on lesser grounds than yours limp along in cold civility for 40 years together. Whatever began this match of yours, your grace, I think you have found your way, the pair of you, to something considerably rarer than duty. I should not waste it fretting over what the idle tongues of 3 parishes have to say about the manner of its beginning. They danced twice that evening, though Rhoda's condition kept the sets gentle and the turns slow, and Ivar found, holding her hand lightly in the candlelit warmth of Lady Ashworth's ballroom with 100 watching eyes grown, by the evening's end, more admiring than curious, that he could not summon even the faintest memory of why he had ever thought 5 careless words a fair price to pay for anyone's safety, when the truth spoken plainly and often, and without fear of its cost, had proven so very much stronger a shield than silence had ever managed to be. They rode home in the carriage well past midnight, Rhoda drowsing against his shoulder with the particular boneless ease of a woman who has spent an evening happier than she quite expected to be. And Ivar sat watching the moonlit hedgerows slide past the window and thought of all that had changed since a morning, some months past now, when he had spoken 5 words through an oak door and very nearly lost, through his own foolish silence, the 2 lives that had since come to matter to him more than the whole of Veldian's long history and Broadacre's combined. Ivar. Rhoda's voice, drowsy and soft, stirred against his shoulder. I have felt her move tonight, I think, or him. First time I have been certain of it, rather than only wondering. He went very still, and then, with a care that made her laugh softly at his sudden solemnity, laid his hand over the curve of her, waiting, and after a long moment felt it himself. The smallest flutter, easily missed. Easily mistaken for nothing at all, and yet unmistakably once felt, the first plain evidence of the small stubborn life they had made together, already asserting itself into the world before it had so much as properly arrived in it. There, Rhoda whispered, watching his face in the dimness of the carriage with an expression he thought he would remember for the whole of his life. You look, Ivar, as though someone has just handed you the whole of the Veldian estate a second time over. Something considerably better than an estate, I think. He kept his hand where it was, unwilling yet to move it, and bent to press his lips to her hair. I have spent this whole year learning what it costs a man to guard the people he loves with silence instead of truth. I do not think I shall ever again mistake the 2 for the same kindness. The carriage rolled on through the dark, familiar lanes toward Veldian's lit windows waiting on the hill ahead, and Ivar sat with his wife drowsing warm against him and his hand resting over the small, moving proof of everything they'd nearly lost and had instead, so narrowly and so completely found, and thought that whatever trials the winter ahead might yet bring, the birth to come, the last loose ends of Vane's trial still working through the courts, his mother's continuing efforts at a warmth she was still, in her own brisk fashion, learning to offer freely rather than dole out by careful measure. None of it frightened him now half so much as his own silence once had, for he had learned in the hardest month of his marriage that a truth spoken plainly, however costly, could mend almost anything that silence, however well intended, could only ever make worse. Winter closed early over Veldine that year, the first hard frost silvering the Succession House glass by the middle of November, and with it came a slower, quieter season in the great house than any Ivar could remember living through before. A season of banked fires and drawn curtains, of Rhoda settled deep in cushions by the library hearth with her feet raised on a stool to Whitlock had all but ordered into permanent service, and of Ivar himself discovering, to his own mild astonishment, that he had grown content to spend whole evenings doing nothing more urgent than reading aloud to his wife from whatever novel currently held her interest, breaking off every few pages to argue amiably over some character's folly or good sense. Silas Vane's trial concluded in December with a sentence of transportation that satisfied Mr. Pryor's sense of justice rather more thoroughly than it satisfied Ivar's, who found, once the matter was truly and finally closed, that he had already spent whatever anger he owned on the man months before, and had little appetite left for savouring his downfall. Sophie Layton wrote from Ashford at Christmastide with news that her girl had taken first place in her letters among the cottage children taught there and enclosed, with a shyness that came through even in her careful hand. A small embroidered handkerchief worked in gratitude for a kindness she said she would spend the rest of her days trying to deserve. Rhoda's time came in the deep cold of January, a fortnight before Dr. Rock had reckoned it. On a night when the wind came howling down off the northern hills and drove sleet against the windows with a violence that made Ivar, pacing the length of the passage outside her chamber, for what felt the whole of his natural life compressed into a single unbearable night. Think more than once of every dark old story he had ever heard of such nights ending badly. His mother sat with him a good part of it, having abandoned, for once, every pretense of dignified reserve to hold her son's hand in the cold passage as though he were a boy again rather than a duke of 38 years, and Constance arrived near midnight, summoned by a rider sent at the first pains, and installed herself at the foot of the stairs, interrogating every maid who passed with a thoroughness that would have done credit to a magistrate. It was near dawn, the storm beginning at last to spend itself against the grey coming light, when Dr. Whitlock opened the chamber door and found Ivar already on his feet, having heard, some minutes before, a thin new cry rise through the old walls of Veldine that he thought he would remember with perfect clarity for the whole remainder of his life. "A daughter, Your Grace," the doctor said, and his weathered face, for once entirely unguarded, wore a smile broad enough to answer every fear Ivar had carried through the long night before he had even finished the sentence. Small but sound, and crying lustily enough to satisfy any physician alive that her lungs, at the least, want for nothing. "Her Grace is tired, but well, very well, considering the hour she has had of it. You may go in if you are careful, and not before." He went in on legs that did not feel entirely his own, past knell-gathering linens with tears standing frank and unashamed in her eyes, and found Rhoda propped against a bank of pillows, pale and damp-browed and more beautiful to him in that single moment than she had ever appeared in silk and candlelight at any ball the county could offer, a small swaddled bundle held against her breast with the fierce, careful tenderness of a woman who had waited 9 months and one long, terrible night to hold precisely this weight in precisely this way. "Ivar." Her voice came thin with exhaustion, but warm through it, warmer than he had words to answer properly. "Come and meet her." He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed, as had become so entirely his habit these past months, and looked down at the small, crumpled, furious face turned up against Rhoda's shoulder, one tiny fist already free of its wrapping and waving with an indignation that struck him, absurdly, as the first true sign of Veldine's stubbornness passed on to a new generation. "Edwina," he said softly, testing the name they had settled on so many weeks before among the dormant roses, and something in his chest that had been holding itself braced through the whole long night finally, entirely let go. "Edwina Rhoda," Rhoda corrected gently, watching his face. "I added the middle myself, while I had the deciding of it these last hours, and rather more leisure than I expected to think on it between the pains. I did not think it right that she should carry only your father's memory and mine, and none of her own mother's name at all, when her mother fought rather hard, this last night, to bring her safely into a world that very nearly did not deserve to have her." He could not speak for a long moment, and when he could, his voice came rougher than he meant it to. "You gave me more than I deserved the whole of this year, Rhoda. From the very first month of a marriage I entered thinking only of a promise to a dying man, and you have gone on giving it every day since, without once demanding I earn it first. I do not know how to thank a woman properly for that, beyond spending the whole of whatever life I have left trying. You have already thanked me, Ivar, 100 times over. In every evening you have not hidden a single thing from me since the morning Silas Vane stood in our hall." She shifted the small, quieting weight against her shoulder, and looked up at him with an expression that held, still, some faint ghost of the wariness that fortnight of silence had first taught her, though it had long since been folded over and softened by everything that followed. "Do you remember what you told me that day in the Succession House, of the promise you meant to keep from that hour forward? That I would never again let 5 words, or 500, stand unspoken between us where a hard truth wanted telling. I have thought of it often, these past months, whenever I felt afraid of anything, the trial, the birth, even tonight, in the worst of it." She reached for his hand. and drew it to rest beside her own against the small sleeping weight between them. 5 small fingers and 5 larger ones curled together over the child both had so nearly lost the chance to raise beneath one roof together. In honesty rather than in the cold civility of a marriage built on duty alone, I thought, whatever comes, he has never once given me cause to doubt him since, and I found the fear easier to bear for the thinking of it. Below in the great hall, as the grey January dawn broke fully at last over Veldine's frost-white lawns, word of the birth spread through the household with the swiftness such news always finds, and by the time the church bells in the village began their own glad, ragged peal. For old custom held that a birth in the great house should be rung in by noon, whatever the hour it had actually occurred. The whole estate had gathered in a loose, informal, entirely unplanned celebration in the kitchen yard, servants and tenants both, passing round mulled ale and news of the small new Lady Edwina, with a warmth that owed nothing to rank and everything to genuine affection for the mistress who had, this past year, earned it stitch by careful stitch, kindness by quiet kindness, until the whole parish had come round, as thoroughly as Lady Ashworth's ballroom had, to loving her nearly as well as her husband did. The christening was held in early spring, when the frost had finally loosened its grip on Veldine's gardens, and the first green showed tentative along the yew walk where Rhoda had once stood. Months before, with her arms wrapped about herself and a stone of misunderstanding lodged where hope ought to have been, Lady Ashworth stood godmother, declaring herself entirely delighted with the honour, and considerably more delighted still with the excuse it gave her to visit the nursery as often as she pleased under the unimpeachable authority of the office. Constance stood the other, her blunt good sense already, by all evidence, marking out a firm favourite in her small goddaughter's affections, and Sophie Layton, invited at Rhoda's particular and insistent request, stood at the back of the small church with her own daughter's hand in hers, weeping through the whole brief service with an unashamed gladness that Ivar found, watching her, more moving than half the grander sentiments offered by guests of higher rank that day. Afterward, in the long gallery hung with generations of Veldine dukes and duchesses who had none of them, so far as any record showed, built quite so precarious and quite so thoroughly mended a marriage as the one now walking beneath their painted gazes, Ivar found a quiet moment alone with Rhoda, while the christening party gathered below for cake and good wine, their small daughter asleep at last in Nell's careful arms after a morning of being passed from one admiring set of hands to the next. "Do you remember," Rhoda said, pausing before the tall window at the gallery's end where the spring light fell warm across the old floorboards, "the scrap of linen you found outside your study door that first terrible morning? I have it still. In the same drawer where I once hid a portrait I was too great a coward to give you plainly. I finished it, you know, some months back, in the quiet weeks before Edwina came, when I had little else to do but sit and sew and wait." She drew a small folded square from the pocket of her gown and pressed it into his hand, a christening cap, he saw now, the green vine she had begun so long ago grown full and complete around its edge, worked through with tiny white blossoms she must have added in the weeks since, and at its centre, worked in the same careful thread, 5 small stitched letters that spelled simply a single word, beloved. "I could not fit 5 words into so small a space," she said, watching his face as he turned the little cap over in his hands, "so I chose one instead, and let it stand for all the rest, for everything you have told me since that first terrible morning, and everything you have shown me every day you have kept your promise not to hide a hard truth from me again." I wanted her to wear it into the church wrapped in proof that the 5 words that once nearly broke this family were not, in the end, the truest words ever spoken beneath this roof. Ivar could not answer her at once, his throat too full for it, and so he did the only thing that seemed equal to the moment. He drew her close, there in the gallery beneath the painted eyes of every Duke and Duchess of Veldine who had gone before them, and kissed her slow and certain and entirely unhurried, kiss that asked nothing and hid nothing and held, in its whole quiet length, every truth he had once been too frightened to speak plainly, and now could not imagine ever withholding again. "5 words," he said at last, against her hair, "very nearly cost me everything I have come to value most in this world. I find I would rather spend the whole of my life now proving, In as many words as it takes, and as many days as I am given, that I love you, Rhoda Jocelyn, that was past all the reckoning either of us thought possible on the cold morning we were wed. That is rather more than 5 words, your grace. She was laughing and weeping both at once, her face bright against his shoulder, entirely, unguardedly happy in a way he meant to spend the whole of their life together, ensuring she never again had cause to doubt. Then I shall simply have to keep saying them, he answered, for as many years as you will have me to say them in. And below them, in the warm spring light filling the hall, their daughter slept on in ignorance of the whole long, aching, hard-won road that had brought her safely into a family now bound, at last and past any door's power to divide again, by nothing hidden and nothing withheld, only by a devotion so plainly, thoroughly proven that not even Veldian's oldest, sternest painted ancestors, looking down from their gilded frames upon the small, sleeping, treasured proof of it, could have found anything left to doubt.